Learning through place. As we look into our rabbit hole and the direction we took in Bristol, we are going to keep in mind a question we literally were interested in. We want to particularly look into how the experience differed for people working on the docks and those who worked in the cranes. It will be interesting to see if we can find any new information about the conditions for the people working in the docks in the 20th century, when the technology was improving and the cranes were used alongside the railways. So our question is, how did the lives of the crane workers differ to the usual men working on the docks? Did they have different treatment or better conditions? In our breakout group, moving into week 4 of Learning Through Place module, our interest peaked as we began to investigate the industrial world of Bristol in the 20th century. The changes that occurred globally over the 20th century made this time an ever-changing and very exciting time. This made us excited to visit Bristol and search further into our rabbit holes. The development in technology created an actively changing experience within Bristol in the 20th century, and there were lots of exciting leads for us to look into. As we watched the walking tour of Bristol Harbourside, we were shown the Prince's Wharf, the Bristol Railway, and the M Shed. This area began to pique our interest and looked particularly exciting. This was because of the vast range of historical evidence of the 20th century which remained there. We were drawn in by the railway at the docks and the prominent cranes too. Then we later went to Bristol and saw these areas in person, spending a lot of time looking into these historical and industrial areas. We also visited the M Shed. This later made us think about the thousands of workers that had been working alongside the docks here for years and years before.
The picture at the top of the slide shows the wharf as it is today, with the M Shed on the left and the 4 remaining cranes on the right. The bottom picture shows the wharf while still operational, when all cranes were in service. Our first stop as we reached Bristol was to the Prince's Wharf. We walked along the harbour, looking at the M Shed and the Bristol Harbour Railway. Prince's Wharf for over 100 years was a shipping area which handled cargo and conducted massively in the trade in Bristol. It aided the development of the Bristol we know today. Prince's Wharf was the last active wharf when the harbour closed to commercial shipping in 1975. We discovered that this area was affected massively by bombing in the World War II Blitz, which meant that much of the area was ruined and had to be rebuilt post-war. When we visited Prince's Wharf, we began to think about the harbour when it was in its prime. Looking at the cranes, we wondered what the area would have been like when these cranes were all in use. We discussed that this would have been a bustling environment and imagined that these prominent cranes were a sign of this. Today, only 4 cranes remain, but we originally know there were a full 8 when they were built in 1952.
Our rabbit hole leads us to investigate further into these cranes. We will both look at the history of the cranes, but we are equally just as interested in the people who controlled the cranes and played a large part in the dock and also the cargo handling. It will be particularly interesting to see what these people's lives would have been like working at the Prince's Wharf, but also what made the work different for the workers who controlled the cranes, and particularly if they were treated in a different way to the usual workers on the docks. The cranes were a vital part of the Bristol docks, creating a bustling and highly successful environment at the time. They were particularly exciting to see in person, as we felt they were a key part of the history of the industrial period in Bristol, which helped make it the place it is today. Looking into these cranes further, we found they were built by Stothard and Pitt in Bath. As technology developed and these cranes were put into use in 1952, the workers were aided massively. They helped unloading and loading ships, which made it a much more rapid process. They were used until the closure of the Prince's Wharf commercially in 1975. The Prince's Wharf was the last wharf to close. When the wharf closed, the Fairbairn steam crane was left to the M Shed, but the remaining cranes were deemed scraps and sold on. Although this wasn't the end, and the group City Docks Ventures managed to find and buy 2 cranes back, the other 2 were bought back by the council in Bristol, and the M Shed were given them to look after. They were restored and now work again. There were not only 8 cranes in 1952, but there was also the Fairbairn steam crane, which we cannot forget. This crane was particularly interesting for us to search into, as we knew from the information we found at the docks that this crane was built far before the other cranes. We began to wonder if this was a hugely important item for the M-shed, as it was far older than the others. As we investigated, we realised the importance of this steam crane. This crane is now a scheduled ancient monument, and the M-shed have said it is now the oldest surviving exhibit of its type in Britain. This crane was built in 1878 from a design by William Fairbairn, who was an engineer in the Victorian period. It was a handy creation, helping with the heavy loads at the time, although the M-shed described that through most of its working life it only had the occasional use. Despite the use of the steam crane being a rare occurrence, we found it interesting that it was a very useful tool during World War II, working all hours of the day, helping handling assault landing craft. It worked until the port was closed, but it is still in working use as it was renovated and can still lift up to 35 tons today. Interestingly, the photo in the top right corner, which we found at the M-shed from our trip to the Bristol, shows the steam crane, but we noticed that this was from before the cranes were built in 1952 were added. We can see the rest of Prince's Wharf, which we walked along recently, and it is completely different due to the bombing in World War II, which destroyed large areas of the docks. The building in the back of the photo was called the Corporation Granary. This was built in 1888, but we have found out that it was bombed in 1941 and was never rebuilt.
The picture on the right of this slide was taken from information boards along the wharf when we visited. It shows a crane driver operating the crane in circa 1950. The crane drivers were interesting, as their role differed a lot to the roles of the usual dock workers. On any one day, there could be around 2,000 people working on the docks, but these jobs were more informal and weren't permanent and set jobs. However, we know that the crane drivers' jobs were permanent. The crane drivers' jobs were also looked up to if they did their jobs efficiently and on time. Due to this, when getting a lunch break, they were always allowed to the front of the queue for there to be minimal delays, as no work could be done by the men on the ground until the drivers were back in their cabs. In order to get a job driving the cranes, the workers had to do 7 weeks of training, but after that they were left to do the jobs by themselves. The expectations were high for the people manning the cranes. This, and many of the other jobs on the wharf, were seen as difficult, labour-intensive jobs. The crane drivers would have to work at the controls for 8 hours with no seat, requiring the job to always get done well. It's particularly interesting to note that as many as 2,000 dockers were working at a time, and we know that when the wharf was closed in 1975, though this closure, huge amounts of people would have lost their jobs. It would have been interesting to find out more into how they carried on and which jobs most of these people moved into. Finally, we looked at what the docks were mainly used for at their height, as due to the way the cranes worked in small loads up to 3 tons, they could not on or offload traditional materials that were being imported at this time. This meant that they mainly dealt in small packages from Ireland or France, containing goods such as French brandy, wine and lard, or bacon, cabbages, butter, or Guinness from Ireland. They also needed to make sure that the packages that the goods came in were small enough for the dock hands to carry them into the storage sheds on the sidings, as there was no infrastructure there to enable easy access into the sheds.